Hello, my name is Apurv Suman. I was a senior PM at Microsoft working on Microsoft Office and in the search and AI organization. And I'm here to share some tips and tactics that you can use to be really successful on your first few days as a PM. This talk is a combination of what things I wish I had known and advice that I've given to junior PMs when they've started out. And it can also be useful for a first-time manager managing their own first junior PM. In general, this is going to be very tactical and example focused. So please reach out with any questions or any follow-ups you might have at my Twitter or LinkedIn that you see here on the slide. And with that, let's go ahead and get started. So you're a new PM. Congratulations, you made it into the job. But you might have just graduated school. You are probably you might be starting an internship. You maybe switched onto a new team. And you've been given this initial instruction of, hey, take some time and get settled in, get your desk set up, and kind of get to know the team. What do you do during this time? How do you use this time most effectively? You're going to feel a lot of tendencies to want to do something right away. Some people call this the syllabus effect coming out of school, where you feel like, oh, I got to have to deliver on some task. And you might be worried what people think of you coming on. And you may even have this feeling of, I need to justify the hire. Really make sure I feel comfortable here. Look, the thing to remember is there are a lot of things you can do to use this time more effectively. And let's take a step back and understand what that might actually look like. So in order to do that correctly, instead of just throwing a bunch of tips at you, we should take a very PM approach to this problem and think about, what does a PM actually do? And that'll help guide us in how we can use this time correctly. Keep in mind that every company is different. Your on-ramping may be one day, it may be up to 3 months. You may not have a product to work on yet, or you may be working on one as you're sort of figuring things out. You have to kind of adapt these tactics and techniques to your whatever works best for you. But it should give you a good starting place to go ahead and get things going. Okay, so there are a bunch of different PM frameworks out there. Probably a bunch of different talks you can go watch. This is a simple one that is pretty common and one I've used throughout my career. If we start thinking about what is it that PMs do to create value, they really focus on the strategy and creating the right product vision and definition, and then executing on that strategy by working across other partner teams or other disciplines like engineering, design, and marketing. Now, that's what they do, but how they do it is they might take a product or a feature or a specific project through different phases of a life cycle. You have a research phase, which is essentially figuring out what are the problems to go focus on, from talking to customers, looking at the industry and competitors. You have the solution phase, where you're sort of figuring out what exactly can we build or design to actually solve those set of problems we found. And then you have execution to actually go make that happen. Now, of course, underlying all of this is leading without authority and really communicating across a bunch of different people to make that happen. And any project you work on is not going to generally flow super cleanly between these phases, but it gives us a starting point to understand what are the things we maybe need to do to be able to do each of these hows or specific tasks effectively. And that, in a sense, is how we're going to approach these first few days as PMs. Let's focus on learning the how, so that way when our onboarding kind of ends or we're in the thick of things, we'll be able to focus on delivering that value, the what, rather than worrying too much about the details of how to actually get that done. Let's start out with communication and influence. Ultimately, being able to do this is the most important factor underneath any of the particular stages. So we're going to spend a lot of time here understanding some cool tactics you can use to be successful. Now, ultimately, you have a boss and they have a boss. And so it's very important for you to start out before you do anything else and talk to your manager and sort of understand what they're expecting out of you, both in the short term during your on-ramp and then immediately after. It's easy to think like, oh, why wouldn't my managers just tell me all these things? But they have a lot on their mind. They don't really maybe necessarily know you super well yet. So it's really important to have that initial conversation. And some of the ways you could ask questions are things like, what is a good PM versus a great PM for you? Where do you expect me to be in 1 month versus 3 months? These conversations will help you facilitate sort of the right expectations between you and your manager, and will help you understand what are things you should be doing to make sure your most important stakeholder is taken care of first. From there, you want to make sure you're scheduling time with all the different partners you might be working with, both on and around your team. Now, keep in mind, these people have been told like, hey, you're new to the team. They're going to go a little bit more willing to make time to see you. So this is a great opportunity to build those relationships very early on. Some people are unsure about how do I start a conversation like this with a stranger. And so some example questions I like to do is, get to know their story. What's your story? How did you end up where you are now? What do you think is the difference between a good and a great PM? What do you like when you're working with PMs? What are the biggest challenges you see the organization having now? And what did you wish you knew then? And that'll sort of give you the right framing to understand over time across a bunch of conversations how all these different pieces and stakeholders work together. Building on this, you also want to make sure you're attending a broad range of meetings. Early on, even if you have an initial starting project, you need to understand what it is you don't actually know yet. In order to do that, you kind of need to embrace a bit of more breadth and actually just attend meetings that seem interesting or with stakeholders you've already met or know are influential. This way, you'll start to understand, okay, here are some things that are going on. Here's some of the language and verbiage people talk about with things. And also, importantly, it gives people a chance to see your face, which is really important especially in a remote world. So make sure you're showing up as much as you can, put your camera on, and really have an opportunity to get to build some of these relationships early. While you're doing that, of course, you want to make sure you're asking a lot of questions. It's very tempting at this point in time to worry that, people might think of me as not knowing the right things or, having some regret around even like, do I have some kind of doubts about whether or not I should be here? Relax. Everyone has been in your shoes at some point, new to the job, not knowing anything. No one expects you to know all the intricacies of what's going on right now in the company or in that organization. This is the golden opportunity to ask. A good trick you can use here is no one wants to be the person in a meeting that asks, 20 questions and like derails a meeting or spends an entire one-on-one doing that. So one of the tricks I like to do is anytime I heard an acronym or a term or a concept that I didn't quite understand, I would start writing it down and I started compiling a list of all these questions. What I would do then is I would save the last minute or two of all my one-on-ones as an opportunity to get a clarification on some of these questions. So, I might have a 15-minute one-on-one with, let's say, one of my engineering counterparts, and I might save the last 2 minutes of that 15 minutes to actually talk about, hey, I heard this term. I don't quite know what it means. Can you tell me what it is? And over time, that'll help you build this sort of set of knowledge you need. And you can continue doing this even after your onboarding phase. Lastly, there are always opportunities on a team to sort of take care of smaller projects or tasks that maybe somebody doesn't have the cycles to do. And this is a great opportunity for you to learn and meet a lot of people while also showing you're a team player. So a great example of this is when I started working out on my second team at Microsoft, I realized we didn't have a great onboarding document for my specific working group. And so as I was learning things, I went ahead and documented some of those things. So that way the next person would have this information codified. And it also resulted in some positive conversations. As we move into the research phase and we start talking about knowing the product well, you'll see a few more examples of this low-hanging fruit that you can do early on to get the ball rolling. Now we've come to the research phase. The real theme here is this is your opportunity to become a product expert. And actually, you could probably even start doing this before the job. There's nothing really stopping you from learning as much as you can about your product and really understanding it in and out. And keep in mind, you're a new perspective on the team. There are probably people on the team who have been working on hard projects for a very long time and maybe haven't had a chance to come up for air and sort of reevaluate things or see how things have changed. So your new perspective could be very valuable, especially say if you're coming from university where maybe you're a target demographic that your team doesn't have represented. So let's talk about these different tools that you can to use research that you would actually do on the job. You got to know how the product works. You have to understand competition in the industry. You want to understand what your users are saying, and you want to be very data-driven in making decisions. So what are some steps you can do early on, even before you have a project, to actually start learning some of these things? Well, first and foremost, you should play with the product yourself. A great way to do this is to actually read the guides that your company publishes, or the user toolkit or something like that, that actually helps you get set up and use the product. If you're having trouble figuring that out just from reading those documents, it's probably a great opportunity to actually suggest improvements. Like, for example, maybe we need to add these shortcuts in, or this language doesn't really make sense to somebody who's maybe coming from a mobile-only perspective. These are great examples of ways you're contributing to the team and learning about the product as you go. The next is competition and trends. There are so many different ways to understand what's going on in an industry. I like doing a SWOT analysis. It's a really easy way to organize where are the strengths, what are the weaknesses, what are the opportunities, and what are the threats. And in doing so, one of the ways you can contribute to your team is actually codify this, maybe present it to them in a memo or a presentation. And you can even do competitive teardowns of some of those threats to understand, okay, here's a new competitor that's jumped into the space. How do we compare? This is a great way for you to learn and become a product expert, and then again, have some low-hanging fruit wins. Another thing to keep in mind as well is you really want to understand where your organization is in its life cycle. Is this a startup? Is it a growth stage? Is it maturity? Is it post-maturity? And you want to understand, what does that mean for your product? Are you really coming in and trying to innovate and create new revenue segments? Or is it more about defending your position against new upcoming companies? Knowing that context early on will be very important as you then dive into your first project, so you understand how the company is operating. User feedback is, of course, the lifeblood of many PM projects. So you want to make sure you familiarize yourself with the core channels you have. This could be in-app surveys. It could be ratings on the App Store. It could be reviews that your company publishes online. Really familiarize yourself with these to understand what are the main pain points customers are running into. Understand who are the different customer segments that are actually saying these things, so you can understand how you prioritize them. And then it's always good to just do something informal and be a little bit scrappy. I like to ask some of my friends, hey, what was your least or favorite feature of this product? Sometimes I'll go on Reddit and Twitter and just peruse those channels or subreddits for feedback there, or maybe even just pose a question to get some initial raw understanding of where to look. Lastly, being data-driven is a critical part of being a successful product manager, especially nowadays. And in order to be effective, you really want to understand what are the ways my team actually collects data and uses it to make decisions, and what are the tools and ways to actually answer data-driven questions. So some of the things you could be doing, one is actually understand what are the key metrics for my product. What is the monthly or daily active users that we're tracking? How has it changed over time? What is the retention across a variety of different features? And in fact, it's good to actually maybe ask some practice data questions like, how often are users using feature X in September? See if you can go answer that question by either writing the queries yourself and understanding how the data pipeline works, or potentially working with the team to understand who is it you need to go ask to go get these kinds of answers. Doing this ahead of time will make it so that when you need to get your first data-driven questions done, you already know the right people to go ask or the steps you need to do to be successful. Now we come to the design phase. This is where you're trying to come up with the right solution to solve the problem you're working on. Now, if you don't have your project yet, or maybe even if you're just starting out and don't know where to begin, one of the best things you can do is really try to figure out what is the gold standard held for product managers in my organization. And you can do that by looking at the stakeholders you would normally pull in to write, a spec or some kind of work output, and go ahead and work with them ahead of time. So starting with your team, one of the things you can do is, ask your manager who can write a really great spec or product requirements doc or some kind of work output I can look at to see, hey, this is the quality bar. These are the kinds of things that are expected, all the way from formatting to what are even the headers I need to make sure I have when I'm thinking about this. It's a great way to sort of hone your thinking in on what the team is looking for. Another thing you can do is look for apprenticeship opportunities where you can actually help out on something specific. This is a great way to get to know some people early and work on part of the project and sort of observe how some of the senior PMs work. So for example, when I first started out, my second project in Microsoft Office, I took over just the UX part of a big feature investment that a senior PM was working on. The senior PM took care of all the big things like all the stakeholders, the technical pieces, the go-to-market. But there was a small scoped amount of UX work that needed to be done. Working on it let me learn from the senior PM indirectly, and also gave me a chance to meet with some of the designers on the team sooner, making it that when I had my first project, on my first product that I needed some actual UX work, I already knew everything I needed to do. Moving on to the other disciplines that you may actually need to work with, and we sort of talked about this in the last bullet, you want to start to get to know the engineering and design disciplines pretty early on because you're going to be working with them very regularly. And in general, figure out all the different teams you might work with in this regard, right? Like, the researchers your team works with, the sales and marketing people, the copywriters. These are people you're going to be going back to all the time. And you need to think about what are their goals and commitments for this upcoming period, right? Your team overall, your product overall has certain goals, but the different disciplines usually have important investments they're making for the next month, quarter, or year. And you want to understand those so you can work with them more effectively and build the proper amount of empathy and trust. Related to this, you also have to work with usually other teams in the space, right? So if you're at a big company, this might be a partner team that owns part of the platform you work on. It could be a sister app team that works on a very similar space and works with similar users. You want to make sure you understand what are their goals for the upcoming period. So that way you can either leverage them to your advantage or understand their challenges and work with them more effectively. Finally, we come to the execution phase. This is really about understanding how your code gets to customers and really understanding the product development cycle. Now, the key to this phase is you really want to understand what the map is and all the different stages are along the way. You don't want to be filling that in as you're actually walking it for the first time. So these are some good questions to make sure you get the answers to early on to understand what are all the different stages required in developing and shipping a product. So first and foremost, you want to understand how does engineering and design schedule their work. They probably maybe use Scrums or some kind of project management system to understand what's going to be done in their planning in the short, medium, and long term. And you want to understand how they work so that way you can make the appropriate asks and understand how to work backwards or schedule your work appropriately in the right sprints. So this is key to sort of building that trust with engineering again, coming back to that communication and influence piece. And the sooner you do this, the better you'll be able to hit the ground running with your own work when the time comes. The next step, of course, is to really start getting customers to actually play with your feature, your improvements, get it in their hands. And so depending on your company and depending on what they call it, it could be an alpha, beta preview cycle. It could be having, doing dog fooding internally and then having some kind of insiders audience. It goes by many names. The whole idea is there's some way for customers to use your product before it's released to the whole world, to the general audience. And so you want to understand what are these different channels that are available to me and what's the correct way to use them? What's the minimum quality bar I can push a feature in to one of these rings so I can get some early feedback while I'm designing. Of course, related to this and really tying in with the theme of being very data-driven, you want to understand how you flight and actually experiment with features or improvements made to products. Usually this involves some kind of data system, some kind of usually somewhat complicated flighting mechanism. So you want to make sure you understand the nuances of it and understand who are the right people to talk to, what are the right levers to pull, how long does a typical experiment run. One of the things I like to do was set up a dummy experiment where I just have two groups, even though they might be the same, and just make sure I can run an experiment end to end, get the scorecard and analyze the results, or at least know the right person to ask for help with those things. Finally, your feature, your release, your bug fix, at some point it's going to go out to real customers and you need to work with marketing and sales to understand how do we make sure our customers know about it and how do we reap the benefits of that, whatever it might be depending on the situation. So all in all, this is the entire life cycle of after you've figured out the problem, after you've come up with a solution, you've actually built that solution, how do you get it out to customers and how do you validate its impact? One final area I wanted to come back to is some common mistakes that junior PMs can make when they're first starting out on their first PM job. And we hinted at this at the beginning in thinking about some of those feelings you might have when you're on your first day on the job or your first starting period. And it's really difficult to know, hey, do I need to deliver something as quickly as possible? Obviously, impact is very important, and you should always be thinking about that through your career. But remember, PM is not just about execution, it's also about strategy. And so whatever you do, you want to make sure you're doing it thoughtfully and using your own time well. And so make sure you don't over optimize for just doing something quickly rather than actually making the correct kind of impact you want. Second, right, you have this manager title in your job description. You may think or have this sense that I need to come in and really establish my authority really early on, or really take control of a project group that maybe I'm stepping in for or starting up. Look, the key thing is that you probably don't know everything you need to know to be successful. A lot of the people you're working with may have been there or may be more experienced than you. It's totally okay. In fact, it's encouraged to sort of be more of a listener early on and make sure you understand all the problems. And eventually you will sort of be able to take that lead without that authority, because you'll be synthesizing the information across all the different stakeholders. And that's how you build your credibility, not coming in and sort of really over flexing early on. And last thing is, it's very easy to be worried that, oh my God, these people are going to think I'm not smart, I'm not intelligent, because you're worried about asking a stupid question, or maybe you feel like you need to justify the fact you've been hired somehow. It's really important to know that everyone has been in your shoes at some point in time, and everyone remembers that feeling. It's far more important you take the time to do the learning, really focus on those how skills, and that way when you actually hit the ground running, people will be amazed to see that you've only been on the job for a short amount of time, and that's that golden moment you're really looking for. So we've made it to the end. Here are some key takeaways for you as you sort of leave this talk and sort of jump into your PM career. Remember, you're going to be given this very unclear, ambiguous time at the beginning. You have to figure out how to use it most effectively, but just remember that this is your time to really learn the how of the PM role, especially in your own organization. And that way, mastering that early on is what's going to let you focus on the what later. And doing those things is what's going to give you a chance to be really successful in the short term, in the medium term, rather than over optimizing for the very first few days. Think about those 4 key dimensions of the how. On the communication and influence side, think about building relationship, investing in that time early. On the research side, really try to become that product expert as much as you can. Use all the different channels available to you. On the design side, learn what that gold standard is. Who are the people doing the best work? How can you emulate them? And then on the execution side, learn all the different steps along the way so you can be more effective when your time comes. It's been really great sharing some of these tips and insights with you. If you have any questions or ever want to chat about PMing or sort of where things are going, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter or my LinkedIn. Thank you so much for listening and have a really great day. Bye-bye.